All right, onto our Stealthwatch Enterprise. Actually, before we get into the Enterprise, we're going to kind of compare and contrast Enterprise and Cloud. We will have a dedicated section on Cloud, and when we kind of compare and contrast these two, we can see, Stealthwatch Cloud has a lot more flexibility with software as a service or with your small and mid-size businesses. When you look at enterprise, it is going to be geared more towards the larger enterprise businesses. And if you want to host on site and have your dedicated appliances. So you're probably going to have just a little bit better overall user interface with the enterprise if you have a ton of flows and you're really evaluating a lot of different types of traffic. But again, it has to boil down to how much traffic do you have? How many flows are you looking at per second? And you can mix and match. So if you do have an enterprise environment and you also want to monitor your cloud, you can kind of mix and match between both of these. So you can sort of get the best of both worlds. Do want to emphasize that your cloud does do on-premise for your local area network. So sometimes that is good for the small and mid-sized businesses. But if any of you didn't already realize, Stealthwatch was previously known as Landcope. It was acquired by Cisco back in 2015, but I think, Cisco was a big pusher or advocate of Landcope for a long time, and their hardware did integrate very smoothly with Cisco for some time before we even saw the acquisition. So their relationship, their partnership was strong even before the acquisition. But the whole purpose of Stealthwatch, I know we've kind of touched on it a lot throughout the class and we'll continue to touch on it, but it allows us to be able to evaluate our entire infrastructure. So we're looking at every known host and who they're talking to. How long are they talking for? What is normal? We're going to be recording that information and figuring out what is the typical day in our enterprise. Do we constantly have these particular subnets that are always talking to these particular servers? And also applications, right? When we look at end users that might work from home, that are constantly using SaaS applications, or if we have just end users from outside that are constantly going to outside resources, we're logging all of that to see what is normal. And then in the event that something doesn't look normal, we need to be alerted and we need to be able to respond to those threats. So it gives us this anomaly detection. We're looking for things that are outside of the normal. Now, we do sort of look at this as network as a sensor, or NAS, not as a solution. All right. So when we think about sensors, a good analogy that I like to think about when it comes to sensors is what exactly is normal. Like when we look at even just our vehicles, right? If I have a American car, maybe their sensors aren't tuned to be as stringent as some of the European cars. If my front left tire is low and it's only 2 pounds of pressure low, do I need to be notified or not? Maybe I do want it to be more stringent and maybe I do want to be notified. So, you can kind of think of this very similar to that sort of theory or that sort of concept. So what are we monitoring? Everything from access layer switches to routers to things in the cloud, server infrastructures, DMZs, everything, you name it. And most of the telemetry, we are going to be looking at, and that telemetry is, of course, things like NetFlow and IPFix and all of the different ways that we can monitor our flows. So here are some of the components that sort of tie into Stealthwatch Enterprise. Generally, we need some type of license that's just going to carve out what is the maximum volume of flows that we can support. All right, so you can look at some recommendations on how to evaluate your network to see where you might fall in with regards to licensing. And of course, that's always flexible. As far as the flow collector goes, this is generally the physical appliance in an enterprise environment, but it can be virtual. And if it's virtual, of course, we as administrators can many times get very granular on how much physical resources from our server do we want to put towards this appliance. But it's allowing us to be able to aggregate all of the flows in our environment. So the net flow or IPFix telemetry is all going to be collected here, and we're going to be monitoring it, analyzing it, categorizing it, and establishing that baseline. When we look at some of the flow collectors, just one single flow collector can store up to 4,000 flows from variation of sources, or 4,000 flow sources, and up to 240,000 flows per second. So keep in mind, there's organizations that have more than one flow collector, so it can be extremely, extremely scalable. So once we have our baseline, we're going to be pumping all that information into our management console, or our SMC. So all of the reporting, we're going to be managing from here. There's a couple different ways that we can look at this management tool. And a little bit later in this section, you'll have the ability to kind of poke around inside SMC just to see what some of the different types of reporting are that's available. So here are some of the ways we can interact with SMC. We have, of course, a Java client and a web user interface, and here's an example of what the web dashboard is going to look like. And generally, when you go through the process of installing this, there's going to be some recommendations for, your reserved RAM and CPU and the number of flow collectors you're going to have. So you can always go through the Stealthwatch configuration guide on how to set all this up. There are, just some minimum and some maximum requirements. And of course, the more hardware that you throw at it, the better overall quickness and interactability you'll have with the software client. So, if you're going to have like 2 flow collectors, you might need 32 gigs of RAM and 4 processors, just minimum, right? But you can always put more towards it. And then, of course, your storage space is also going to depend on the number of flows per second you're going to have. How long do you want those log files? So if, you're going to want those log files for maybe just a couple months, 2 terabytes might be fine. But if you have, a lot more flows and you want to hold on to them for a longer amount of time, then of course you're going to need more overall hardware. All right. We also have just some examples of the installation process. There are also some great resources online that instruct you through this. Kathleen McNamara at Cisco, she does some great videos and training on ICE and also Stealthwatch and how it can integrate. So there are some lots and lots of resources other than just the physical documentation that you can look at. But essentially, once we've downloaded the app and installed the IPs and given it a name and pointed it to the right flow collectors, basically we're going to have the ability to go into our dashboard to be able to access all of the different functionality. So you can see some examples of this too as you're going through some of the simulations a little bit later.